So hi, we are going to have a conversation talking about who we are, our lives, our achievements, the challenges we face. So all of those things. So first of all, let's start with introductions, and one of us can start, maybe alphabetical order, if that's okay. Can we start with Cleo? Cleo, what would you like to tell us about yourself? How would you want to introduce yourself to us?
So Cleo is a South African little girl, and I come from a family where I am the only girl. And often I'd say to my parents, because I follow two brothers, and I'd say to my mom, whom I'm living with now, well, God must have heard your cry because He decided to give you a beautiful girl following the two boys. And Cleo is very passionate of following the footsteps. You know, in an African context, you always say you're given a name that you would follow. And my African name means mother of children. And funny, that is a career that I started following. And I did a diploma in early childhood development. That has been a fantastic journey for me, learning to appreciate the children. And not a mother myself, often other women would say, how do you have a good relationship with others, particularly children, when you don't have yours, your own? And I guess that's a gift for me. And I'm a community builder. I love being around people often at times. I've recently moved this week because I felt my door has been so open for everybody that I now lack it's more of a time for me. And so Cleo is basically somebody who offers herself for the better of the others. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cleo, for that. Wow. The only daughter, that's something very special. Thank you. Heather, can we hear from you, please?
Yes, hello. I'm like you, Florina. I like to just go with the moment, so I don't have a script for introducing myself. I was thinking, listening to you, Chloe, that for me, I feel like I'm a woman of contradiction. I'm very hard to, I don't fit all of the categories, I suppose is the way I would introduce myself. And I was just thinking that I was born into a white Australian family. My father's family migrated to Australia from England. So in many ways, I come from a story of privilege, but I also come from working class family background where there was a long generational history of trauma and post-war trauma and dysfunction, really. So my life and my personality are a lot of kind of conflating contradictions. I'm an Anglican priest, so I'm part of a traditional organization, and I have a traditional side to me, but then being a woman in that role, I also have a progressive side to me. I'm a student. I'm doing my PhD in Franciscan studies and developing a pedagogy based on the life of St. Francis. I love to research and to write. I love to immerse myself in research, but I also love people. I'm a leader and I'm a community builder. And at the moment, I'm working with international students here in Australia, in Melbourne, and developing a lot of peace building programs here at the University of Melbourne. And what else? I'm married to Adam. I've been married for 17 years and we have a little girl who's asleep now. She's nearly 7 years old, Mary.
That's lovely. And I think I've had the privilege of seeing your little baby. So that's a special moment. Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. So Sonali?
Thank you, Florida. Hello, everyone, and happy Women's History Month and happy International Women's Day. So I'm a Sri Lankan American and a lawyer by profession. I most recently worked as a senior diplomat and delegate to the United Nations in New York. And I was a UN correspondent before that. And I'm also a lecturer and educator and an editor and writer as well. So I reinvented myself many, many times. I think that is because I'm the youngest of 6 children. four girls, two boys, um, and I've learned, I think, to navigate throughout through this huge family, and lots of voices, loud voices, and I've had to, as a as the youngest, you tend to you need to do that. Um, I came to America actually because I fled Sri Lanka after my journalist husband was killed. So there is, I suffered for a long time from PTSD once I came here. So it has been a challenging journey in many ways, but I think overall, any lived experience um, is something to learn from, and that's where I am now.
Thank you so much, Sonali. It was great to hear from you, and also to read about yourself and to know the challenges that you've been through. That's Thanks for being strong for all of us. Thank you. Valerie, what would you like to tell us about yourself?
Thank you. I certainly appreciate the opportunity, as my friends and colleagues have mentioned, to be here today, National Women's Day and Month. And I would really like to talk about who I am. And that is a child of the first generation of African Americans to integrate public facilities. My parents and grandparents fought to end legal segregation and opportunities for my generation to attend particularly public schools, believing that a good education was the gateway to realizing the American dream. And so I have the experiences, the scars, the stories of what it feels like to be a majority of 10% in a country that 4 generations before me are my ancestors were slaves. And that journey, that reconciliation still resonates in America today as protest, demanding justice, parity, and inclusion. And as a public administrator, someone who has served cities and communities my entire adult life, I have the privilege of trying to make a difference, trying to change the order of things from inside the system rather than outside. And I bring an interest and a love for other cultures, other experiences. I love learning. I collect the first editions of Harlem Renaissance writers. That was the period in America when American writing and art was at its highest. I also collect indigenous art from all over the world as a way of recognizing that no matter where we live, there's still a commonality of interest, of faith, of commitment to community and commitment to children.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valerie. And maybe I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you this question. You have done a lot of work in public service and have achieved a lot. What is your biggest fear about being in power? Because as women, when we achieve power, there's a certain amount of women on the top, and there's so much being said about us. So what is your biggest fear as being a woman in leadership role or being in power?
Well, first of all, I don't bring fear to the responsibility of leadership. You don't become a leader by being fearful. I have recognized that in order to lead a community, I first had to have courage. When I was appointed city manager of the city of Petersburg, Virginia, early in my career, the headline in on the editorial page said, "When she was hired, she was superwoman. Now that she's here, she's fair game." And so it set the tone for the attitude and approach that I was going to have to reconcile if I was going to lead that community. And Petersburg, Virginia, during the Civil War, had the highest number of free Blacks of any city in the nation. And so a huge history steeped in the struggles and challenges of America. And it was important to me to show that a woman of color could lead that community. So I had the courage, the fortitude, and the confidence of my convictions that I could do the work in the way that it could be done, and that I was going to follow the oath of the Athenian state to make that community better when I left than it was when I came.
Wow, that's amazing. And that you started by saying that there is no need to be fearful when you're in a leadership position, because it's a responsibility and the courage that you've had. Thank you so much. Would you like to ask any of the others any questions or anything that you want to hear from us, Valerie?
Well, certainly, I would love to have Heather talk to us a little bit more about how she integrates her faith with the work she does every day in community.
Wow, that's a great question. I'm still working that out, Valerie. Every day I'm working that out. It's been a real process for me, and it's an ongoing process to learn how to bring all of myself authentically to the table, my faith as well as all the other parts of me, but obviously they're integrated. And also really learn how, as a leader, to provide a safe cultural space for others to do the same. And I really believe that that's something we have to get a lot better at in the church. And I also think it's a skill that we need to start teaching in Bible colleges and seminaries, which it is a skill. So actually, it's interesting you mentioned, because out of my research that I'm doing at the moment, I've just founded a little organization called the Francis Project. And we have our first pilot group this year of 12 Christian leaders. And the purpose of this group is to develop cultural intelligence and in peace building skills in leadership as Christians. And it's about how we lead within our church communities, but also within the world in interfaith and multicultural contexts as well. And so it's a really important question to me. It's becoming my life's work. I don't have an easy answer, but I think that well, maybe it's about being fearless. And I love that you started with that. I mean, I wish I could say I've been fearless as a leader, not at all, but I'm a feel the fear and do it anyway. I think that oftentimes we, as Christians and people in my church circles, we can be a little fear driven in terms of wanting to protect this sacred thing to us that is our faith, and thereby actually not even consciously engage in kind of almost manipulative behaviors to set up scenarios where we're not really going to be challenged or pushed back on, or where we're not really engaging with the stories and experiences of people that are different to us. And I think that's about being able to create a space where we can be really healed of the shame and fear in our own story, have that courage to bring our faith with all its authenticity to the table, but also really be comfortable with meeting other people where they're at that might be different to us, might be the opposite of us. And that's the answer, I think. So one thing I found helps is just being real with people about actually my own shortcomings, my own learning, my own process, the things that are changing in me as I journey in my faith and as a leader. And instead of trying to present as someone that has it all together and has all the answers, instead it's someone whose faith is helping me grow and progress. And that's the narrative that I like to bring in my work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. Yeah, I'm just going to swing back to the fear and fearless aspect. So it was very interesting to hear one person say fear, one person speaking, but fearless, and how we are working through that. Sonali, I'm going to ask you this question. You as a leader, I'm going to combine these two things, leadership and challenges. What are some of the challenges that you have faced being a leader?
I think for me, having worked in office environments and in government departments, I just want to come down to the grassroots of it and say the toxic, inhospitable environments that are so entrenched in the culture of an office or a government department. Also that some women just accept that kind of bias and that kind of discrimination. Women who do not sometimes have the capacity or the education to detect or to understand the thousands of microaggressions that are leveled against them, or leveled against women of color, or women on various economic and social levels. And they accept these microaggressions as the norm, and those are huge challenges because you feel then that you are alone. Even if you have other women working with you, you do feel that you are alone. Having also to raise your voice just to be heard, to repeatedly point out that the great idea that was just applauded coming from a man was actually your idea in the first place, or a woman's idea, it's not yours. Or having to be called pushy just for not being a pushover. These kinds of things, being called bossy and unladylike for doing a job well. And because of this, to see women dream small and accept for themselves something less, and accept for themselves something within this negative reinforcement and societal beliefs that have clipped women's wings for so long. So I think those are real challenges that I have had in my experience, especially working in places that I have worked.
Being called pushy for not being pushed over. Wow, I've never heard that before. And that was like so important, that you stand your ground. Thank you so much, Sonali. Do you have a question for any one of us? Do you want to hear any of us? Oh, yeah.
Maybe I'd like to ask Cleo, with her South African experience, what she feels is her achievement or the achievement of women in South Africa, especially in relation to her.
So South Africa has a very fertile ground, being a rainbow nation, the diversity, and I guess the spearheader in many of the African countries with the democratic governance that really holds close to make sure that the people understand that being an individual and living your potential is important. However, that has many pitfalls also for us as South Africans, because the idea and the vision is very clear, but the pathway and the process to do that is very blur. What I mean by that is you might know where you want to see yourself. As a little girl, I dreamed of being a dermatologist. And when the hard knocks come and you need to go forward, you couldn't, because then the medical university preferred to have white students before the blacks could enroll. And these are not things that the world knows, or we know, even as Black South Africans. And the achievement for me with that has been, my mother was an orphan and my mother never went to school. For her to see her little girl go to university was the biggest achievement. And I hold that, it's as if I was walking the journey with her, and for her to see a life that she had never known or thought she would do. And the other achievement into that whole journey was the inner healing, because we often find that external achievements define what you would have. And I think for me and my mother, as an extension of her, I think it has been the journey of finding our deepest healing within the journey of not being, or not matter. I don't know how to put it. You do not matter to the men. You do not matter to society. You do not matter anywhere. But your inner healing makes you now stand up and say, but yeah, I matter to me. And that changes the whole scope at its best. And for other women out here, it's that the voices are raising, and more women are finding that they can hold their own potential. Whether we view single woman houses or single woman homes as a pain, but we see that also a lot in South Africa. And these women are growing a generation today that is making a change. And I think, not coming from, again, the other thing about South Africa is that we're very traditional, we're very cultural. So the roles of the two, decades from, when now women are starting to lead, women are now starting to live life without fear because a man does not exist. it becomes a shock. And then when you see a new generation, it's how do we have it, and how do you call this generation? Our diversity has brought the opportunity to view life in a different manner. But again, our diversity is leaving us to every day want to understand how do we create this path, because there isn't a manual. There's never we've been there before. There isn't a guidance, but how do we strongly hold we're seeing as our own vision as the young women living today? So the biggest is that we attach our academic, our financial, our economic success to our inner healing, because that's the only way we find that we transform best, when the holistic person looks at life in a holistic way. Anxiety was the biggest thing for me, because every time I looked at the new step, I would fall back and say, I can never do it. And that is where I come from, because as a girl who grew up in a deep culture, you're always being given fear statements that don't. But having to look at life and say, I do, was another thing that I gained as an achievement. And I think that's a motto that grew and that is influencing other women in my generation that are seeing themselves achievers.
Thank you so much, Cleo. Thank you for that. I do. Yes, it's a challenge. Yeah, we have to stand up to that and be brave enough to say that. Wow. Heather, I want to ask you something. When you introduce yourself, you introduce yourself as a leader. You said, I'm a leader. So can you tell us more about what leadership means to you?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think that's evolving for me as well, because I do think we all have a different leadership style. And what really resonated with me was what Sonali said about being called pushy, but not being a pushover. I think one of the contradictions in me is that even though I have this kind of gentle femininity in the way that I look, the way that I speak, I also have this real directiveness. I mean, kind of like how you shouldn't lead as a woman. I mean, I'm doing this inverted commas with my fingers, but I do have a pretty directive style by nature. I have a kind of follow me, we're going to try something new. Do you want to jump on this ship and come with me and try this out? And it's taken me a long time to feel comfortable in that skin and roll with it. So I think there's different leadership styles. Mine is I'm the kind of leader that can vision something new and build a team around something that hasn't been tried yet. And so that's the kind of leadership I love to do. But I think in the end, leadership's about facilitating for people to work well together to achieve a positive outcome. And we need different kinds of leaders for different kinds of outcomes, I guess.
Thanks, Heather. A leader that we'd like to follow. So I think, yeah, from what you're saying, somebody with action, somebody who will lead us. Thank you so much for that. Do you have a question for any of us, Heather?
Oh, well, I was actually thinking, Cleo, when you said that there's no manual for women's liberation and for progress in this space, but I was thinking in my cheeky little mind, but if you had a personal manual, what would be your, I don't know, top 3, elements that you think, if you were to write the manual, what are the most important 3 aspects for you for moving forward for equality for women?
Can I call them chapters? Maybe in that manual.
Chapters, yes.
Yeah, the first chapter would be know yourself. Often as women, we're being created or we're being told you are defined by what is around you. So define yourself first before you are defined as a mother, before you're defined by anything else, your clan name and all of that. The second thing is be confident in your decisions. Often as women, because we've got this emotional intuitive, we tend to lose confidence in the decisions that we make because we feel for the others more. So be confident in what you would be believing in. The third part is never forget to spoil yourself. I think those would be the top 3, because again, it's in our nature to always care for the others, to nurture. We seldom look after ourselves. So never forget to nurture and support yourself. So those would be the top three chapters in my manual.
You know, I know, and I was wondering, how do you self-care if you do live and work in an environment where there is a lot of trauma all around you? You know, I was thinking about the students that I'm working with who are living in Myanmar at the moment or have family there. If you are in an environment that's highly traumatic, how do you self-care in that, you know, in that kind of space?
Just saying that I think we need to normalize trauma and grief and not treat it like a taboo. And I think if we were to start making that a priority, because we are a generation, or we're living in an era where we're having to reverse most of that pain and trauma. So self-care would become important if we hold the importance of trauma and grief as opposed to other issues which are also important. So let's give it the importance that it needs to be, so that it can acknowledge and find time that it needs to have.
When it comes to trauma, because something that I have seen, and Cleo, thank you for bringing that up. One thing that I have seen, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, and especially if you work as a journalist, is that trauma is stigmatized. You have to show that you are hard, you are able to get the story, and you cannot accept or you cannot admit to trauma yourself. If I could just bring my own experience here, when I came to the US, I did not even understand that I was traumatized. And I could not give a name to it. I could not label it. And the most important thing for me was when I could label it and say, no, nothing is wrong with me. This is part of the trauma. Because as a writer, I came here and I wasn't able to write. And I realized then that part of your brain, which controls writing and language, it diminishes for a time with trauma. And that was what was going on with me. And so the ability first to understand what's going wrong, and I think that is a great part of self-care. And the next, I think, is also, if I were to look at my own experience, is to shut out the noise. Because as a journalist, we had so many, and as a woman journalist, you have a lot of social media, cyberbullying, and character vilification. And it's the ability then to go to those places or to people who can give you strength and who can give you comfort, and just shut out that noise. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you so much. And I have to be mindful that I don't turn this into a session on trauma, because I have worked on it and with all of your expertise. But I just want to add this aspect of they think that it's easy for us women to deal with trauma because we are able to express ourselves than men. However, it's also neglected or foo-fooed as, oh, these women, they always talk about, how difficult life is or how sad life is. So as women, how do you think you deal with this kind of a situation? Valerie, do you have anything to tell us about, again, transgenerational trauma, but also about in leadership positions when you are upset about something? I mean, how do you deal with the situation? Because my biggest fear is, and I often talk about this, I feel that when I become a leader, I do not want to become a man. Because I associate man, I want to be a woman. I want to be able to cry sometimes, and I want to have everything, the aspect of womanhood with me. So how do you deal with that, Valerie? What are your challenges around it, or how do you deal with that?
I think Cleo said it best for all of us when she said you have to know yourself, and you have to be yourself, and you have to be your true self if you're going to be a leader. And I certainly, as a city manager, had situations where we had employees who died in the line of duty, where we had police officers who were involved in shootings of African-American men, and communities came to protest and some instances experienced civil unrest around those actions. And I found I had to be me. When something hurt my heart, then I'm going to have tears. when I talk about how that feels for me. And as a leader, it's genuine because that's really how I feel. And if I didn't bring that genuineness to the issue, people would somehow feel it didn't ring true. And so if you have tears, then you need to have tears. And just try to make sure that it's appropriate and that's the moment. One of the challenges you find is, as a public official, you have to be mindful of what you say. You can express sorrow without expressing blame or acknowledging that it's someone's fault, because that in America, that's a lawsuit. And that has huge ramifications for public organizations. But I think if something terrible happens, you have to say, this is terrible. How are we going to come to grips with this as a community? What are we going to do together? I happen to have been in a community where there was a tornado. And actually in the eye of the tornado, I was in a building in a historic district. And we were having a meeting, and suddenly it sounded like a train was overhead. And then the building started to rumble, and the bricks started to fall. It was an old brick building. And we got out just before the building was demolished, and a few bruises. But I realized, I'm the city manager. We just had a tornado in our downtown. I don't have time to worry about, how I feel. I've got to mobilize our emergency forces, make sure people are okay, and get to the governor's office to ask for help. We have a military base nearby. And so you have to mobilize, you have to act, you have to engage with other people. You have to assess what's going on, and all of those external thoughts take it away from you, and you start to think about, what can I do to make a difference? How can I make it better for everyone else? I clearly wasn't seriously hurt, or I wouldn't have been able to think and to do. But when people saw, me rallying downtown, knocking on doors, and making sure people were okay, they came and said, well, she's doing this, let's join her. Let's not have her do this alone. And so being able to be genuine helps you mobilize, makes people feel comfortable coming to work with you as you try to respond to the emergency, determine what happened. And so I think we can use our strengths, the fact that we often lead with heart and head, as a way of bringing communities together to solve shared problems.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for that. Do any of you also want to respond to that question as to how do you deal with people not being used to having women as leaders? How do you work with that? How do you bring your emotions out?
That's been a huge part of my experience in leadership in the church. Not so much in other spaces outside of church. It's where it's a lot more accepted. But I really feel like it's taken there's something shifting for me as I'm entering midlife, where I feel comfortable with the sound of my own voice, and I feel comfortable in my body, and I feel comfortable in the way that emotion comes through, in the way that I speak, in a way that 10 years ago I did not, because I was so self-conscious all the time that the role modeling that I always saw was of a man speaking in a particular way with a particular style, and I didn't have female role models. And I had this belief that, that people wouldn't take a woman seriously in leadership because of these aspects. And but I found that it's the opposite is the truth in a way. People are hungry for just authenticity and diversity, and for a female voice. Not that every female voice is the same either, but and this, I guess what I've learned is that power and authority doesn't reside in a male voice, it resides in an authentic voice. And it can be a gentle voice, and that could be the most powerful. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's very inspiring. And it's also inspiring I'm sure it will be inspiring to many of the young women, men who are listening to what you are saying about this, because like you said, role models, it's a challenge for us to find role models. And here you are, we have one among ourselves. Thank you so much, Hedda. Cleo, what do you think about this? Cleo? What do you think about being in power, and how do you feel as a woman? How do men relate to you? Is there acceptance, or do you think it's a constant struggle, a battle?
It's a constant struggle and battle. in the line of work we do here, there's a statement that says, women are so far developed. You know, when democracy and the world changed, there was a lot of movement to capacitate a woman and a girl child. And when that happened, a boy child was left behind. So they're using power, dictatorship, and everything to try and maintain their masculinity. And in that case, they are hurting the good that women are doing. So there is a lot of challenge in that. And I think mostly it's because they do not know how now to treat, to deal, and to walk alongside a woman who is equipped, who is self-reliant, who is willing to work for herself and not follow the cultural norms and societies that had put in defining what a woman should and is to be. So it's a challenge, and I think for me, two things. It's two moral values, honesty. It's hard to be honest as a woman in a dishonest world. And it's also hard to be a loving person in a hurtful place. So these, you know, they contradict so much. And for me, they bring fear. I'm an easy person and I connect easy with people, but you tend again to be hurt, not because you are calling for it, but because your morality and wanting to care for the other was being manipulated in the course of the whole thing. So if more and more conversations where men and women could come together, I have no problem giving a solution when you haven't said I should give a solution as yet. But if you know, there could be platforms where men could be open enough also to talk to us, and we both share where we are feeling fearful and where we're feeling the gap is, so that the biggest fear that we're facing as women could be eliminated. Because some could be in our heads, but some is also in leadership. Did you see it in reality?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cleo. We don't often hear the word love when it comes to leadership. You know, it's always about power and authority. So it was very refreshing to hear the word love, to give love in leadership. Thank you so much for that. Sonali, what do you think about this? You already spoke about challenges. So do you want to say a little bit more on, as a leader, as a woman, how do you work with your emotions?
It is a challenge, as the others have said, and I too was taken by what Cleo said, that it is hard to be loving in a place of you know, in a hurtful place. And I think we do that by, for me at least, being a woman of faith, I do that by reaching into those spaces where I can go for refuge. But really showing your emotion, I have had sometimes I've had to go to the restroom, you know, because you don't want to show that emotion, and that's something you have to deal with and you have to understand. And as Valerie said, you have to know where it is necessary or where it is okay to show that emotion. But the most important thing, I guess, is to be as authentic and as genuine as you can be. But it certainly is a challenge to always show that emotion. I think there are times when you have to hold back in certain instances. That's my take on it. I think there are some situations that need to be looked at in a more objective way, and especially if you're working in the global space. But I want to say, because the fact that men were brought up and how challenging it is to work with men, I think the challenge is, especially with the older generation of men, the younger generation especially, they are a lot more tuned, I think, and sensitive to women's rights and, you know, racism and gender issues. And there is this great movement called the He for She movement that UN Women has, that is very important, because we have to realize we can't do this without the men, because they're 50% of the population. So we have to get the men on board, and the men have to know that this is not a woman's issue, this is a human rights issue. And this is something that we have to all work together, because then it is better for the entire world.
Thank you so much, Sonali. And as you're all responding, I'm thinking if we had a group of men, as you know, being interviewed for leaders, I probably would have never asked these questions. I would have never asked, how would you deal with your emotions? Because we just take it for granted that no emotions, or they will be able to deal with it. But when it comes to women, we often think about how we work with it, and how we are perceived also, because that is very, very important. Cleo, I'm going to ask you, do you have questions for the others, Cleo? Do you have anything that you want to ask from anybody else here?
I'd like to ask Valerie, for you to find your confidence, how long was the journey for you to connect to yourself?
Cleo, one of the things that happens when you grow up in, as you probably know, at least from your parents' perspectives, in a segregated society, is that when you are integrating that society, there's certain experiences that you have. You are maltreated, you are disrespected, you are threatened, you are challenged, and you have you either fight or flight. And I decided that I wasn't going to run, that I wasn't going to, in the words of an old civil rights song and spiritual, Negro spiritual, I used to be called, I wasn't going to let nobody turn me around, that I wasn't going to let someone else decide my future, that I was going to make that call myself. And so I developed the capacity to figure out the best solution to the problem. If being threatened when I was in college, I was told in a classroom by a professor that as a Negro, I should not have been admitted to the school, that I didn't have the capacity to learn as whites did. And this is in a college classroom of 50, 100 people. The university at the time had 28,000 students. Well, how embarrassing is that? First of all, to be singled out like that, to be told that you aren't as good as other people, and you should have never been allowed to integrate into the state's largest and most prestigious university. Well, I decided, a couple of my friends decided that I'm not going to take this course, and they dropped out. And I purposely decided to stay because I was going to change his mind. At the first couple of weeks, I had to go to the dean almost every other day to demand fair treatment, demand attention, to demand a review of the grade that I had received. And ultimately, that professor, I don't know that he particularly liked Black people, but he ultimately became a supporter and a confidant, and hired me to work for him as a student aide. So I was determined to change his mind because I was better than that. I was not going to be bullied. And so just developing the confidence that comes from a determination that, I was the first. My parents and friends and colleagues, they died to give me that chance. And I was going to let somebody bully me by a voice. I just couldn't take it. I just couldn't do it that way. I had to be stronger, and I had to have the faith of all those generations before me to succeed. And ultimately, I was able to do that. And I'm at the stage now in life where I set the agenda. And if you can't dance to the agenda I set, then you don't get to play the game.
Wow, that is fantastic. That's really, it's amazing. And thanks for the question, Cleo, because when you said, how did you get there? What is it that brought you there? That's an important question, because we often ask ourselves, there are steps, and Heather was talking about how in her life, she's there, she's starting that step. So Heather, you have Valerie, you can look up to and say, I will get there. I will set the agenda. And all you guys follow me.
She's tough, she's tough.
Well, my staff used to say that I was a hammer and a velvet glove.
Mm.
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. And I was just thinking about leadership, and how sometimes when you are a strong leader, there's so much that happens to pull you down. Yeah, and in our culture, we have this thing about women pull down women. Yeah, so we have this, again, a cultural thing where the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, there's always a friction, and they say the biggest enemy for the daughter-in-law is the mother-in-law. So they generalize and they say, if a woman is coming up, the one to pull her down is another woman. How would you all react to this? Do you think it's true? Because I fight tooth and nail and I say, no, it can't be a woman. And I bring in my own little story and I say, it's the man in between all of this, who kind of puts us against each other. So how would you react to this? Do you have that in your cultures to start with? Or how would you react to a statement that it's women who bring down women? Maybe we can start with Sonali because I think we are closest in culture and probably you've heard that.
I've heard it many times and always coming from the mouths of men. Not much from women, but there have been instances, I know quite recently, there are two examples that I cannot name organizations, but in one organization, this woman was being sexually harassed by her boss, her male boss, and those who rallied around her so that she could take action and go to the next level of the internal mechanism were the men and not the women. And she told me this, and she was very tearful because she felt that the women were using that against her so that they could rise up on the ladder. So that was one instance. I can tell you, with me, when I was much younger, and I was afraid at that time, I was young, of giving public speeches, and I thought what I thought was quite a good public speech. I had practiced, and I was, I had my thoughts correctly, and I had a good basis for what I was saying. But this older woman came up to me and she sort of mocked me, and she said, oh, there are, I had spoken about 3 pillars, and she just mocked me, and she said, so these 3 pillars, and she was quite mocking. And the men who were around there were not. They just came and told me, look, it was a very good speech. So there are instances like that, but I don't think you can generalize in any way. But yes, and I'm sure the reverse is true as well. A lot of men bring down men, but we don't talk about that. So it's important to remember that it works both ways.
Thank you, Sonali. What about the others? What about your cultures, or what do you think about this?
This is Valerie. I'd also like to respond, and it may certainly be American culture, but I do a lot of writing about the dark side of leadership. In my experience, women have often been the ones who work hardest to make you unsuccessful and to pull you down. And I think about the way American women, particularly in my generation, grew up. We grew up with limited opportunities to work together as teams. We were the cheerleader, the homecoming queen, and they were individual recognitions and opportunities. You competed against one another. We compete against our mothers for the attention of our others. We fight for the most handsome man. And so we have grown up in an environment of competition. And so it's hard to, when you get into the workplace, suddenly develop an egalitarian spirit. And so a lot of it means that, we have to learn how to work together and learn how to be a team. And so one of the things I've really tried hard to do as a woman leader is to pull up other women and people of color so that I'm not the only one. And if it's just 2 women and you're competing for a single job, how terrible is that? But if there are 100 jobs and there are, 1,000 people, then the dynamics and the interest and issues are very different. And so creating paths and opportunities, because often we're competing and we're pulling one another down, as the earlier example was, because one person, 2 people in one job, the only way I can get ahead is at your expense. Well, let's change the narrative so that we're creating more opportunities for one another. And that means we don't have to have a head-on-head competition. And it's hard to do. I found that what hurt me the most is when other women were cruel enough that my job or my station were in question, because I expected better. The generation before me generally lifted down to help. When I first started in the workplace, most of the women were executive assistants, administrative secretaries. They were the support to the male leader, but they were also the ones who would help you get on the calendar or the agenda, would give you a heads up about what was happening. And they really helped develop the capacity because the doors were not open for them to assume that responsibility. And so I've tried hard to help women move past the need to compete and recognize the value of coming together. Today, I'm part of an organization in our state called the Matriots, and we are a political action committee, and we raise money to support women candidates. When we started 3 years ago, fewer than 20% of the statewide elective offices were held by women. So our big, audacious, hairy goal is by 2025 to have 50% of those offices held by women. And so I think working together as women, be it in a sorority, a political action committee, in an organization, I always develop capacities for women, brown bag lunches to come together and share stories. I was even sued once for preferring women over men by having programs. In my office, you can come bring a sandwich and let's chat about getting ahead, about the challenges, the opportunities. Let's learn together. And so I think if you create the space for sharing and learning and building the capacity of everyone to recognize we aren't in competition, we share a lot of the same goals and values, or we wouldn't be in the same organization, we wouldn't be in the same space. And helping women realize that. And it is so rewarding to know that you've made a difference in somebody else's life, and that collectively then you're moving an organization forward.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I mean, we often say that I have suffered so much, so I'm going to let the other woman suffer. But you gave us a different perspective and said, I didn't have the opportunity. So can I give the opportunity to somebody else? I think that's fantastic. And to also to remember to work as a team, because, instead of competing with each other, how do we pull each other along and how do we go? Thank you so much for that. Heather, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to share that to almost flip it on its head, something I've had to really confront in myself is I've noticed I have also had an attitude of not wanting to celebrate the success of other women in my sphere of influence, and a suspicion of women who reach a higher level of influence or reach senior leadership roles, like a suspicion of their motives. And I've had this negative attitude that I've noticed inside of myself towards it. And I've had to really sit with that and go, what is that, And I think that, in my context, a lot of the legal structures that prevent women from advancing into leadership roles or into senior roles have been taken down, but there's so much cultural barrier and psychological barriers still. And I've had to really confront my own idea that it's wrong to be ambitious, and that it's not ladylike, and it's not feminine, and it's not humble, and it's not good to be ambitious, to be in a senior role, or to work hard to become more influential. And one of the most powerful moments for me has been when I realized that I had this really negative attitude towards my mum for being driven and ambitious in her leadership and in her work. And I brought myself to apologize to her a couple of years ago. I realized I needed to name this, that I wasn't really celebrating her. And I had this, and it was really about me. It was really about me not being comfortable with the parts of me that are ambitious and that want to succeed. So yeah, so I'd share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. I just have to share this little story about my mother. I'm just like, I have to do this now. So I mean, growing up, similar feelings of, my mother was a teacher, so not so much of respect. Oh, she's just another teacher. And one day I came back from school. One of my teachers had slapped me on the face. And that time we could still beat the children, in school. And so I came back with this 5 fingers on my cheek. And my mother doesn't speak English, so she never came to school. I went to an English medium school, and so she never came to school. When she saw me at home with this, she dragged me to school. And it was, school hours were closed, but it was a convent, so she knew the nuns were there. She dragged me to school and she knocked at the convent door. And I was so scared. And then when the sisters opened, she called for the principal. She said, in the local language, she said principal. And then the principal came and she just said this one thing. She says, I have never beaten my daughter. How dare you touch her? And that day, my respect for my mother just rose. It just went. And then it just became, I mean, we're talking about role models, right? I mean, my mother was never a public speaker or nothing. But then now as I grow up and I see what she has done for us, the kind of subtle examples she gave, or the way she dealt with her life, the way she rose, the way she did not put up with any nonsense, all these things inspired. So sometimes we look for role models outside, but then they are there at home, they are there with it. My mother-in-law is a great role model for me. The lady who lives upstairs, fantastic. So it's amazing. Theo, I want you to think about, respond to what inspires you. What inspires you? What keeps you going? What is that drives you? That's one thing. And then I also want you to talk about words for upcoming leadership. What would you want to tell young women, even young men? What would you want to tell these young aspiring leaders? So let's start with the first question on what inspires you, what drives you, what keeps you going?
One of the things that inspired me is being around other people that are inspirational. Attending the UN Women's Conference in China, as an example, where thousands of women from all over the world came together to celebrate their femininity and the role they played in their community. That was some of the most inspiring and heartwarming experiences of my life. I will say to Cleo, being an African-American, and tapped by the U.S. Department, U.S. Aid, Agency for International Development, to go to South Africa and be able to train Black Africans who were applying for jobs in local government but needed the training, and working with the technicons in those days, now universities, to develop the capacity and opportunity for them to effectively compete through training and education. To work in local government, you needed a degree. And yet if you were fighting for freedom in your country, you may not have gone to college. And so when the opportunity came, you couldn't meet the paper qualifications. And so to be a part of the learning and the development and the inspiration, as someone with African background, that was just awe-inspiring and amazing to me, to be part of that development, part of that change, part of the synergy of what could be in the world. And I would just say my family. You talked, Fiona, about the inspiration of parents, and my mother in particular, again, was a leader. She reminded me very much of yours. While a professional, she didn't take any crap. And she demanded the best of us and demanded that we be treated with respect. She and my father worked very hard to expose us to real life. And to do it in a training sense, so that we understood what the options were. I never went on a date without having money in my pocket to be able to get home and to know how to get home. And so some were just very practical, small things, and some were others, smart things, that I was as good as anybody else, and that my future was determined by how hard I was willing to work for it. And my mother told me one other thing that really helped me over the course of my career, and that is that I could always go home. And so knowing that if I made career choices or love choices that didn't work out, I wasn't stuck, that I had an option, that I could always go home.
So I will let Heather or Sonali respond to that. Sonali, you want to go?
Okay. So two things inspire me. Firstly, like Valerie said, and you said, Florina, I come from a family of strong women, and they inspire me. And my mom inspires me. She was a teacher like yours, Florina, and she's now 94 and still leading. So she inspires me. And secondly, without a doubt, the younger generation. I see them at the workplace and within my family, and they're so much wiser and more sensitive to diversity and inclusion than we were. I listened to my niece on gender and diversity issues, and I'm amazed not only at how articulate she is, but how well attuned she is to the nuances of diverse, common, gendered living experiences. and they're a lot more receptive to forms of activism. And they are in the forefront of vibrant movements, the younger women, as we have seen with Greta Thunberg, with Malala and others. And these young people just inspire me every day, and I just want to grow up and be like them. And you know, we have to understand that we are living in this overwhelmingly young world where 46% of the people are under 24 years of age, and this population really represents this unique demographic dividend that can contribute to lasting peace. And so it's the older generation and my family, and definitely the younger generation, they inspire me.
Thank you so much. I love it when you say, I want to grow up and be like them. Yeah, for me, the main thing that came up is the scope for growth. So it's not like been there, done that, I have achieved. No, but then the scope for growing. Thank you so much for that, Sonali. Heather, what do you think about?
Along the way, on the journey that I've been on, there've just been amazing men that have come into my life who've supported me. And it's easy to focus on the negative experiences, but I'm choosing to focus on the positives. And even just this week, before I came to this gathering tonight, I was working on my PhD for 3 days, and I went to stay at a monastery, and this Catholic priest, Father Dean, who I've known since I was a kid, he lets me stay there for free to work on my studies, and he cooked dinner for me 2 nights in a row, and he just takes an interest in me. And this is just one story, but you know, they've always been really supportive men along the way who've been good and who've believed in me and supported me, and so I'm choosing to focus on those experiences. And for young people, for the next generation, I would say you don't have to wait till you feel completely ready to step into the next leadership challenge. You know, every great leader feels nervous and feels maybe I'm not quite equipped for this, and you just keep taking the next step.
Thanks, Heather. Valerie, do you want to say something for the young generation, for the upcoming generation?
You know, I really do. The first piece is to learn how to see with a third ear. And by that, I mean that you really need to observe what happens in the room and not always be thinking about what you're going to say next, but observe the relationships. I learned as a leader, a manager, that when I convened a staff meeting and I did all the talking, I learned nothing about the dynamics among the team members. But when I stopped talking and watched and listened and heard and observed who's rolling their eyes when someone speaks, who's nudging when someone has a comment, who's paying absolutely no attention and is writing, all of those are clues to the healthiness of your team, of the relationships of the people that you're working with every day, and quite frankly, a trust level. And so being able to recognize who you can trust, who's on your team, who's with you, is so important. So that would be one advice, to learn how to see with your third ear. The other is to recognize that all people deserve respect, and that humility is something that is part, to me, of leadership. That I am the leader in an environment when it's a city government and I'm the city manager. But when I am at home with my family and my husband, he certainly does not see me as the leader of the family. And in fact, at times has said to me, you're not in charge here. I don't do what you say, as a reminder if I sort of come home with that leadership face on. But we're all in a role where we lead in some instances and we follow in others. And being respectful and doing your work with humility, and recognizing that it really does take a village. None of us got where we were by our single meritorious work alone. Someone opened a door, someone gave some guidance, someone made an introduction, and that the best part of what you can achieve is to give back all of those thousands of small things that someone did for you to others.
Thank you so much. I was really laughing a lot about what your husband says, because I think many of us can relate to that. You know, leave your shoes outside, your leadership shoes, or whatever you are outside, and then at home you're different. But I guess it's the same thing we can tell our husbands also. I think that's for me when I feel that I have arrived or I have achieved something, I can tell my husband the same thing. My husband is a professor, so I can tell you, I'm not your student, so don't talk to me like I'm your student. Yeah, I'm your wife. So that's interesting how we relate. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. I just wanted to end by saying that each of you have your own inspiring stories, your challenges that you've dealt with and risen, and to also to remember that it's not like we have arrived. We have still a long way to go, you know. And in that journey, we are going to take other women along with us, and men. I think all of us spoke about that. And Heather, thanks for reminding us about the fantastic men in our lives. And I have a whole list, starting from my dad, who was amazing. Usually when I have these sessions, I sing, you know, and I don't have a great voice, but I still sing. And my only excuse is my dad said, you know, only when you sing, you know, your voice comes out, you know, something like that. So to know that these fantastic men have been around us, and also to remember to acknowledge that they also acknowledge us. I think in a group of men, that they also acknowledge our presence and how we have played a role. So thank you for this wonderful evening together, evening, morning, midnight. Heather, I'm sure it's the next day for you already. Thank you so much for that. And different weather conditions, bad internet, everything we have managed. Let's continue inspiring each other, you know, the stories that we share, because I really wanted this to be a light session, because this is about women leadership. This is about us talking, not about, you know, coming up with an agenda with points written down, PowerPoint presentation. No, sharing, talking, living our lives. So thank you so much for this, and wish you all a happy Women's Day, and maybe continue to inspire ourselves and the generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such a terrific job moderating. Yika, thank you for bringing us together. This is
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thanks so much, ladies. I hope to travel with you again.
I just want to say this is I'm coming from a communist Czechoslovakia, where we were forced to once a year to celebrate Women's, and so I do not like and celebrate Women's Day because I was forced to. But this is the first year that I actually am grateful and want to celebrate. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.